You are 13 years old. You are crowned king of a kingdom surrounded by enemies, and you have a secret, a horrifying secret that is eating you alive piece by piece. Your nerves are dead, your flesh is decaying. By the time you are 16, you can barely use your hands, but with those hands, you will lead a tiny army against 26,000 of the world's most feared soldiers, commanded by the legendary Saladin. Hollywood gave him a silver mask to hide the horror, but the truth is far more brutal and far more heroic. This is the story of Baldwin IV, the boy king whose body was his own worst enemy and whose will was the most powerful weapon in the Holy Land. To understand the miracle of Baldwin, you first have to understand the knife's edge upon which his kingdom lived. This was Jerusalem in the late 12th century, not a monolithic European outpost, but a complex, vibrant, and incredibly fragile society. For nearly a century, the Crusader states, or Outremer, had clung to the Levantine coast. They were a sliver of Christendom in a sea of Islam. Their castles were mighty, their knights were fearsome, but their numbers were few. They were an island, and the tide was rising against them. They were surrounded by enemies who viewed them as invaders, and holding this land required constant vigilance, brilliant diplomacy, and ruthless warfare. Into this powder keg, in the year 1161, a prince was born, a boy named Baldwin. He was the son of King Amalric, and from the moment he drew breath, he was the hope for the future of the kingdom of Jerusalem. A heavy burden for any child, but no one could possibly imagine the true weight he would be forced to carry. Baldwin's fate was sealed not on a battlefield, but in a sunlit courtyard during a children's game. His tutor was one of the great historians of the age, William of Tyre. William was responsible for the prince's education, and he watched the boy closely. He saw a bright, promising student, quick to learn with a love for history and riding. But he also noticed something strange. He watched as Baldwin played with his friends, a game of endurance where they would dig their fingernails into each other's arms. It was a silly, boyish contest. Yet while the other boys would eventually cry out in pain, Baldwin never did. He would take the abuse, unflinching, with a smile on his face. At first, William thought the boy was just incredibly stoic, a sign of future greatness, but the observation gnawed at him. He took Baldwin aside and tested him again, pinching his arm, harder this time. There was no reaction. The boy simply looked at him, confused. It was then that a cold dread must have settled over William. This wasn't fortitude, this was a terrifying absence. The boy couldn't feel pain in his right arm. It was the first, insidious sign of a disease that had no cure, a disease that was considered a divine punishment: leprosy. The diagnosis was a death sentence, not just for the boy, but potentially for the kingdom. In an age of faith and superstition, leprosy was seen as a mark of sin, a physical manifestation of corruption. How could a king, considered God's chosen representative on earth, be so visibly unclean? The political implications were catastrophic. Yet when his father, King Amalric, died in 1174, the law was clear. The throne passed to his only son. So, at just 13 years old, the boy who felt no pain was crowned King Baldwin IV. Imagine that ceremony. Inside the most sacred church in Christendom, the nobles of Jerusalem swore fealty to a child they knew was afflicted with an incurable, disfiguring disease. They pledged their lives to a king whose own life was already on a timer. The kingdom was too unstable to risk a succession crisis, so they put the crown on his head and appointed a regent, Count Raymond of Tripoli, to rule until Baldwin came of age.
They likely thought he would be a king in name only, a tragic figurehead who would fade away quickly. They were wrong.
While Jerusalem was dealing with the crisis of a dying king, a storm was gathering on all sides. A new power had risen in the Muslim world, a Kurdish warrior named Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. History knows him as Saladin. He was everything the Crusader kingdom feared. He was not just a brilliant military commander, he was a pious, unifying political force. He had seized control of Egypt, then Syria, effectively encircling the Kingdom of Jerusalem. His life's mission was clear: to purify Islam and to drive the Christian invaders into the sea, starting with the recapture of the holy city of Jerusalem. Saladin was a master strategist. He looked at Jerusalem and saw weakness. He saw a kingdom led by a sick boy, riven by internal factions fighting for power, the hawks who wanted war, the doves who wanted peace, and the schemers who just wanted the throne for themselves. Saladin knew it was only a matter of time. He would let the kingdom rot from within, just as its king was rotting, and then he would strike. 2 years after his coronation, Baldwin turned 15. This was the age of majority for the kings of Jerusalem. Everyone expected him to let his regent, Raymond, continue to rule. But Baldwin was not a passive victim of his fate. In a move that shocked the court, he formally ended the regency and took full control of his kingdom. This was no longer a boy playing king. He began asserting his authority immediately. He confirmed treaties, settled disputes, and most importantly, turned his attention to the looming threat of Saladin. He refused to be a ceremonial, invalid monarch hidden away in a palace. He planned a bold attack on Saladin's power base in Damascus. The plan itself was audacious, forcing Saladin to react and showing the world that the King of Jerusalem, leper or not, was a force to be reckoned with. The disease was progressing, but so was his tactical mind. He was learning to fight 2 wars at once, one against the armies of Islam and another against the cells of his own body. In November of 1177, Saladin decided the time for waiting was over. Believing Baldwin to be weak, distracted, and near death, he made his move. He gathered an enormous army, perhaps as many as 26,000 to 30,000 soldiers, and crossed the border from Egypt. This was not a raid, it was a full-scale invasion aimed at the heart of the kingdom, Jerusalem itself. Saladin's intelligence told him the main Crusader army was away in the north, dealing with another threat. He believed the road to Jerusalem was wide open, defended by little more than a handful of garrisons and a dying boy king. He marched with absolute confidence, allowing his army to spread out, to raid and pillage the countryside as they went. Why not? Who was there to stop him? He bypassed the fortress of Gaza, brushing aside its small Templar garrison, and headed straight for the city of Ascalon. His prize, Jerusalem, was almost in his grasp. It was the gravest miscalculation of his entire life. The news of Saladin's invasion sent a wave of panic through Jerusalem. The main army was too far away to help. All that stood between Saladin's massive force and the holy city was King Baldwin himself, with what little forces he could muster. The numbers were laughable. Baldwin had perhaps 375 knights, including a contingent of 80 Knights Templar and a few thousand infantry, a total force of maybe 5,000 against nearly 30,000. Any sane commander would have retreated to the impregnable walls of Jerusalem and prayed for a miracle. But Baldwin was not a sane commander. He was a 16-year-old boy who had lived with a death sentence for years. Caution was a luxury he couldn't afford. He made a decision that seemed like pure madness. He would not wait for Saladin. He would ride out and meet him.
He gathered his tiny army and raced to the coastal city of Ascalon, managing to get inside just before Saladin's army surrounded it. He had placed himself directly in the path of the storm.
Saladin arrived at Ascalon and saw Baldwin's tiny force holed up inside. He wasn't concerned. He left a small detachment to keep them bottled up and continued his march inland. In his mind, the Christian king was trapped and irrelevant. The main prize was ahead. But inside Ascalon, Baldwin was not idle. He was waiting. He had summoned the Knights Templar from Gaza to break through the siege lines and join him, which they did in a daring raid. His force was now slightly larger, but still hopelessly, comically outnumbered. Yet Baldwin had an advantage Saladin had completely dismissed: audacity. He knew Saladin's army was now strung out, overconfident, and marching through unfamiliar territory. He knew that his only chance, his 1 in a million shot, was to do the one thing Saladin would never expect. He would not just break out, he would attack.
Before they rode out, Baldwin commanded the holiest relic in Christendom to be brought forth, a fragment of the true cross, the very cross upon which Jesus was said to have been crucified. It's hard for us in the modern age to grasp the power of such an object. This was not just a symbol. To these men, it was the literal presence of God on the battlefield. It was proof that their cause was just and that victory against all odds was possible. Baldwin, racked with disease, prostrated himself before the relic, praying for victory. For a boy whose own body had been forsaken, this connection to the divine was everything. With the true cross raised high, infusing his tiny army with the courage of martyrs, the 16-year-old Leper King ordered the gates of Ascalon to be thrown open. The hunt was on.
Saladin's army was near a place called Montgisard. They were disorganized, crossing a ravine, their baggage train bogged down in the mud. They were completely exposed, and that is the moment Baldwin chose to strike. He had used the terrain to his advantage, marching along the coast to hide his movements. Now he crested a rise and saw his enemy laid out before him, vulnerable and unsuspecting. What happened next is the stuff of legend. The charge of the Crusader heavy cavalry was one of the most devastating weapons of the medieval world, a wall of steel, horse, and lance moving as one, and leading it was the King of Jerusalem. Because he could no longer grip the reins with his diseased hands, his arms had to be tied to his horse. He was literally a part of his mount, a living weapon aimed at the heart of his enemy. The 375 knights, with the Templars at the tip of the spear, slammed into the unprepared Egyptian army like a thunderbolt. The impact was catastrophic. Saladin's army, so confident just moments before, dissolved into pure panic. The charge of the heavy knights tore through their ranks, followed by the infantry who engaged in the bloody work of slaughter. Saladin's personal bodyguard of elite Mamluk warriors was annihilated, trying to protect him. Saladin himself, the great unifier of Islam, was nearly killed. He was forced to escape the battlefield in the most humiliating way possible, on a swift, racing camel, fleeing for his life. The battle turned into a massacre. The Christian army, fueled by religious fervor and the desperation of a cornered animal, was merciless. They chased the fleeing remnants of Saladin's army for miles. Of the massive invasion force, perhaps only a tenth made it back to Egypt. Saladin had lost almost his entire army, his command structure, and his aura of invincibility. It was one of the most stunning, lopsided victories in the history of the Crusades. And it was all engineered by a 16-year-old boy so ravaged by leprosy he had to be strapped to his horse. When Baldwin returned to Jerusalem, he was hailed as a hero, a living saint. He had done the impossible. He had faced the most powerful Muslim leader in a century and had not just defeated him, but utterly humiliated him. The victory at Montgisard bought the Kingdom of Jerusalem nearly a decade of relative peace. It forced Saladin to respect the power of the Crusader state and its unlikely king. It cemented Baldwin's legend. He was no longer just the Leper King, he was the king who had stared into the abyss and made the abyss blink. But for Baldwin, the victory was bittersweet. It had taken a tremendous toll on his already failing body. He had won his kingdom precious time, but he knew his own time was running out.
It's here we should talk about The Mask. The film Kingdom of Heaven famously depicted Baldwin as wearing a beautiful, haunting silver mask to hide his disfigurement. It's a powerful cinematic image, but it's pure fiction. There is no historical record of him ever wearing such a mask. The reality was likely far grimmer. He may have used bandages or veils to cover his open sores, or, as his condition worsened and his legend grew, he may have simply shown his ravaged face to the world, a symbol of his suffering and his sacrifice for his kingdom. The mask is a metaphor for how we often prefer our history. We want it sanitized, romantic, and noble. But Baldwin's story is powerful not because it was beautiful, but because it was ugly. It was a story of unimaginable physical decay, met with an even more unimaginable strength of spirit. The true story is far more compelling than any silver mask. The years after Montgisard were a slow, agonizing decline. Leprosy is a relentless disease. It continued its grim work, destroying his body from the outside in. He lost the use of his hands and feet. He eventually went blind. In his final years, he couldn't even walk and had to be carried everywhere on a litter. Yet he refused to stop ruling. He was still the king. He continued to lead his armies, carried at the front so his soldiers could see their monarch was with them. He presided over his court, his brilliant mind as sharp as ever, even as his voice grew weak. He dictated letters, negotiated treaties, and deftly managed the treacherous politics of his court. Imagine the sheer force of will required to wake up every day in a body that is a landscape of pain and decay, and still find the strength to govern a kingdom on the verge of collapse. He was a king ruling from his own grave, a testament to the idea that true authority comes not from physical strength, but from an unbreakable mind.
Baldwin knew he was dying, and his greatest fear was not for himself, but for his kingdom. He had no children. The heir was his sister, Sibylla. The future of Jerusalem rested on who she would marry. This led to the great tragedy of Baldwin's final years. Against his better judgment, Sibylla fell for and married a French nobleman named Guy de Lusignan. Guy was everything Baldwin was not. He was arrogant, reckless, and militarily incompetent. Baldwin saw the danger immediately. He knew that putting a man like Guy in command would be the ruin of the kingdom he had fought so hard to protect. He tried everything to sideline him. He made Guy regent when he became too ill to rule, only to strip him of the title after Guy proved his incompetence. He even tried to have Sibylla's young son from a previous marriage crowned as co-king, trying to ensure the crown would bypass Guy entirely. One story perfectly illustrates Baldwin's frustration with Guy. Saladin had besieged the castle of Kerak, and Guy, as regent, was tasked with leading the army to relieve it. Guy marched the army there, but then simply refused to attack, allowing Saladin to escape unharmed. It was an act of either extreme cowardice or supreme incompetence. When Baldwin heard, he was consumed with a cold fury. He stripped Guy of the regency and demanded he relinquish his control of the key coastal cities. Guy retreated to his fortress at Ascalon and refused. Baldwin, now blind and unable to walk, ordered his servants to carry him on his litter all the way to Ascalon. He was carried to the gates of the city, demanding his vassal appear before him. Guy refused. The king was locked out of his own city by the man married to his heir. It was the ultimate insult, a sign of the decay that was now infecting the kingdom's leadership. In the end, the disease won the war for his body. After years of fighting, of defying medical reality, Baldwin IV succumbed to his leprosy in the spring of 1185. He was just 24 years old. He had been king for 11 years, but he had lived 100 lifetimes of struggle in that short span. He died knowing he had left his kingdom in the hands of a child, with the shadow of Guy de Lusignan looming over the throne. He had held back the storm for over a decade, but he must have known that the dam was about to break. The kingdom wept for the king who had sacrificed his body and his youth for their survival, but they had no idea how quickly his loss would be felt. Baldwin's worst fears were realized with terrifying speed. His young nephew, King Baldwin V, died just over a year later. Sibylla and Guy de Lusignan seized the throne, and Guy, now in full command, immediately set about proving his incompetence. He broke the truce Baldwin had carefully maintained with Saladin. In 1187, just 2 years after Baldwin's death, Saladin invaded again. This time, there was no strategic genius to oppose him. Guy de Lusignan led the entire army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem out into the desert with no water to engage Saladin's full force. The result was the Battle of Hattin. It was a catastrophe from which the kingdom would never recover. The Crusader army was annihilated. The True Cross was captured. Guy de Lusignan was taken prisoner. With its army gone, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was defenseless. City after city fell, culminating in Saladin's triumphant recapture of Jerusalem itself.
Baldwin's life stands in stark, tragic contrast to what came after. He had shown that the Kingdom of Jerusalem could be defended, that Saladin could be beaten, but it required a leader of immense courage, intelligence, and above all, will. He ruled for a decade from the epicenter of his own personal agony, and in that time, the kingdom not only survived, but thrived. The moment his will was removed from the equation, the kingdom collapsed. His story is not just a footnote in the history of the Crusades. It is a timeless and brutal lesson in leadership. It shows that the strength of a kingdom is not in the size of its armies or the height of its walls, but in the character of its leader. He was handed a poisoned chalice, a dying body, and a doomed kingdom, and he drank from it without flinching, buying his people one last decade of light before the darkness fell.
So what is the unmasked truth of Baldwin IV? It's that the disease that destroyed his body also forged his spirit in a fire few could ever comprehend. He was a boy forced to become a man overnight, a king who had to fight his own biology every single day just to get out of bed, let alone lead an army. He was a military prodigy who at 16 achieved a victory that seasoned generals could only dream of. He was a ruler who held a fractured kingdom together through sheer, stubborn willpower. His life was short, tragic, and filled with pain, but it was also a profound testament to the power of the human spirit to defy the impossible. He proved that even when the body rots, the will can remain unbreakable. And that is a legacy far more real and far more powerful than any silver mask. What part of Baldwin's story do you find most incredible? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to uncover more true stories that are stranger than fiction, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications.